My name is Kevin McKenna. I worked on the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project's LGBTQ plus activism section. This project is not a comprehensive history of LGBTQ plus experiences in Seattle, but the video that you are about to watch does incorporate some interviews that I conducted with funding from the King County Sport Culture Grant and the University of Washington History Department.
This has been a great state to work in, civil rights area. People have a more live and let live attitude than they do in other parts of the country.
As an out genderqueer person living in Seattle, I couldn't be more proud and definitely consider myself very, very lucky.
Seattle's been a hotbed. We've passed things in this city way early on.
Seattle is a place where most of the major institutions that still exist today were started by the grassroots. These were things that I think Seattle should be very proud of, and the LGBT community in Seattle should be very, very proud of.
Non-normative sexuality has long been part of the social fabric of Seattle. But it wasn't until the 1930s that the standard markers of a gay community, such as establishments designed to serve them, first became visible. The Doubleheader, considered by many to be the oldest continuously operating gay bar in the US, opened its doors in Pioneer Square in 1934 and continued to operate there until 2016. In the 1940s and 50s, many other establishments serving the gay and lesbian community were set up. But it wasn't until 1967 that the first homophile organization, the Dorian Society, came to the city. From 1960s onwards, organizing around these issues became a major feature of activism in Seattle, and the work of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in Washington state have helped to yield many pioneering civil rights victories.
Seattle in the 60s, the mayor would proudly report that he was going to rid the city of homosexuals. It was difficult organizing, but there were some powerful and interesting folks in those years, and they did it, and I learned an awful lot. If it isn't there, you build it, and bringing allies together to do it, that's what was happening in the primarily lesbian and gay, or primarily gay and then lesbian community. The word transgender and some of the other terms that are used now to relate to gender identity issues didn't even exist.
Decided to come to Seattle, and the first job I was able to get was as the office manager of the Dorian Group, which was a gay rights organization at the time. In 1977, they brought another desk into the office and said, this guy, Randy Henson, is going to be the office manager for CMEC. What's CMEC? Well, it's the Seattle Municipal Elections Committee for gays and lesbians. We're going to form for this coming 77 election. We're going to have a committee to interview candidates. We're going to rate the candidates. We're going to register voters at bars and out on Broadway. And we're going to have an impact on the city races. And indeed we did. That really was a successful enterprise, and it's my favorite child, if you will, of anything I've had any help in building.
In the early to mid 1970s, sexual minorities in Seattle gained major legal victories when the city passed ordinances that banned discrimination in housing and employment. But the backlash against these ordinances came soon after with Initiative 13, designed to repeal these rights. Initiative 13 came at a time when elsewhere in the country, conservatives had been challenging and successfully repealing anti-discrimination legislation by painting gays and lesbians as a threat to family values and the American social fabric. On the backs of activists utilizing a variety of tactics and messages, Seattle voters stood up for gay rights when they defeated Initiative 13. Along with the defeat of the Briggs Initiative in California, which would have banned homosexuals from teaching, this was the first democratic victory for gay rights in the United States.
In 1978, two police officers in Seattle wanted to repeal the ordinance protecting gay people. There was a big press conference held in Plymouth Congregational Church downtown. All these folks were there representing essentially the establishment of the city, saying this isn't a measure we want to have in Seattle. This is not the kind of place we are. We want to see people protected from arbitrary discrimination in housing and employment. As we went through the campaign, well, it was scary, but we thought we might win. And in fact, we did, but with 63% of the vote, which was an incredible victory.
I do remember the night and the great joyfulness out on the streets when we defeated 13.
The campaign against Initiative 13, the publicity around that effort and the success of the effort was so great that Seattle was viewed as, one of the middle-sized metropolitan areas in the country where not only was it becoming safe or safer to be a gay or lesbian person, but organizations could thrive and organizations could be created that might have been difficult to create in other environments and in other communities.
In the late 70s, I founded Ingersoll Gender Center. We incorporated it as a nonprofit in '84, and we've been at it ever since. And we deal with gender and gender identity issues. And a lot of the reason was I needed to have answers myself, but we also just needed something. We've helped thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, not kidding, just thousands of individuals from around the world deal with questions of who am I and how am I going to bring it into the world around gender and identity.
In 1979, the Seattle Gay Clinic was formed, and I learned about it and decided I wanted to get involved. More and more men were coming in with swollen lymph nodes or lymphadenopathy, which was often a very early indicator of AIDS infection. This was years before we had an HIV antibody test. This was years before we knew the word HIV. We saw this manifesting at the gay clinic as early as 1981, and the best we could do was, try to hook these people up with some kind of medical care so that they could get, a deeper assessment and onto medical care if they could get it. When I look back, 30 plus years later, I think that the Seattle Gay Clinic has been overlooked as a really pivotal place for a lot of AIDS organizing that happened.
People with HIV/AIDS were being incredibly discriminated against. In addition, my lover at the time developed AIDS, and so I was thrust into the intensity of that situation very, very directly. What did ACT UP Seattle do that was really highly significant? 2 or 3 major things that, as I look back on it, I've always been very proud of. First of all, we established the very first large city on the street needle exchange in the United States. The second very, very major achievement of ACT UP Seattle had to do with getting the Bailey Boucher House constructed. Bailey Boucher was a major project of an organization called AIDS Housing of Washington. Not only was it to be a kind of hospice situation for people who were ill, but people who were ill and living at home but needed care during the day.
I worked at Bailey Boucher from '91 until 2004. It's about 13 years. The need to find a better arrangement for care that works more appropriately for people and for their families and partners and just social context was screamingly evident. There was also very few services to support people who weren't at the critical phase of illness to remain independent. That's what came to be Bailey Boucher. There were a lot of people who are both actively supporting the idea of the facility and actively opposed to the idea. Seattle really is the only place in the country, and then I'd say, oh yes, in the world, that built from new construction, a specialized facility for people with AIDS, and also built a remarkably comprehensive, large services for people who are living in the community who needed support. That stuff doesn't happen around the country. It didn't happen. There were periods when there was just an organization for every little need. And one of the things that was most amazing was to watch people sort of self-organize around these issues. And that's where so much of what was really good about the services that began in Seattle really was incredible, because people did do what was necessary and figure it out.
Alexa Manila was really born out of the HIV prevention movement, not during the 80s per se, but more in the 2000s, the more recent decade. HIV is a complex conversation to have, and I think when you mix in drag, I think it makes it a lot more easier to talk about, to discuss, and create normativity of talking about safer sex, talking about HIV. I've always thought that drag is a platform. It's a visual platform. It's a visual voice. I often think that if you're going to look at me, I'm going to make you listen to me. And since then, it's really sort of bolstered my passion for activism. I kind of call it dragtivism.
In the 1990s, same-sex marriage became an important focus of LGBTQ plus organizing in many states. After more than 10 years of organizing around this issue, Washington State passed domestic partnership in 2007. Gay marriage passed in 2012, making Washington one of the first states to legalize same-sex marriage by popular vote.
Between the 80s and the 90s was the main period when I was active in various organizations. On September 10th of 1995, I formed a committee to work on marriage, Legal Marriage Alliance of Washington. We really were convinced that that's one of the pillars, was one of the strongest pillars that we had to take in order to gain equality for the LGBT community. Equating our love lives with everybody else's love lives, it's all just love, was a huge leap. And we knew that that's one, if we could do it, if we could be successful, that's the one that would eventually get us our complete freedoms. It passed, and passing it in this state, that was a great year.
Over the past few decades, a growing number of intersectional organizations are serving the needs of various queer communities. The People of Color Against AIDS Network was founded in 1987 to address the AIDS epidemic in communities of color. Entre Hermanos was founded in 1991 to address the needs of the queer Latinx community. And over the past decade, many more organizations have been founded to address the culturally specific needs of LGBTQ plus communities, including API Chaya, serving the needs of LGBTQ plus Asian and Pacific Islander folks in the area.
I founded an organization called Pride Asia. I founded that in 2012. Our mission is to celebrate, empower, and nurture the multicultural diversity of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning communities through the Asian Pacific American Islander lens. One of the critical programming that Pride Asia does is the Pride Asia event, which coincides with the mainstream gay pride celebrations in June. But what we do specifically is do the Queer Asian Pride celebration at Hing Hay Park in Seattle's Chinatown and International District. We look at that as a celebratory reminder within our API community in the middle of Chinatown at Hing Hay Park, and say, we're queer and we're here, and we are part of the Asian American community. Often when we don't speak to the diversity of our community, then we just default, to the assumed identities. And typically these are the positions of power and privilege. It's successful because of community, because of our chosen families, because of our families, because of our love for each other, our respect for each other.
In working together, sometimes individuals say, a lesbian group might say, we won't accept or work with trans folks. Well, we didn't have that term trans with transsexual people or people experiencing these issues because you don't know who you are, or you're not real, or whatever it may be. Now, sometimes looking back, there's a tendency to get angry at those kind of statements. Gay men would say that as well. Some people still do, but not that many. I tell you though, I look at that time, at least in this culture, as a moment when we were all trying to understand.
I often speak to diversity and just reminding folks that it's okay to be different, whether that means it's about gender expression. Just because I'm not a cisgender male or that I'm not a cisgender gay male doesn't mean that I'm not part of the larger LGBTQ community. I think often we experience horizontal hostility, so I remind folks that it's okay to be different.
We have a close relationship with other oppressed people. When we get together, we feel it and we can express it. It's important to carry that out into action, I think.
Mother, may she rest in peace, used to say, each hand washes the other. And that's the connection between what gay activism has to do and activists have to do with other communities and other concerns of other activism is you have to wash each other's hands. You have to help each other.